I do not resign from our marriage, Alaric. Her voice was calm, but there was a quiet strength behind every word. I resign from the endless labor I have carried out on behalf of this estate for the past 9 years. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Betrayal rarely arrives with the courtesy of a warning. It does not always come with shouting, accusations, or slammed doors. More often, it enters through the grand entrance wearing silk and perfume, offering polite smiles and graceful words while slowly taking the place of someone who spent years building a home from nothing. It arrives smiling at servants who have spent a decade learning to love their true mistress. It accepts the warmth, loyalty, and devotion of a household it did not create. And it forgets the person who sacrificed everything to keep it standing. Isadora Fenwick stood in the grand entrance hall of Fenwick Park on a gray Tuesday morning in October, a leather ledger tucked beneath one arm, and watched her husband present a stranger to the assembled household staff, as though introducing a new head housekeeper, rather than the woman he intended to install as his own mistress beneath his wife's own roof. "This is Miss Arabella Vance," Duke Alaric Fenwick announced, his voice carrying the particular careless confidence of a man who has never once needed to consider the consequences of his own cruelty. "She will be taking up residence in the East Wing, and I expect the whole of this household to extend her every courtesy due a lady of this estate. Mrs. Pewit, you will see that her rooms are prepared immediately." Mrs. Pewit, the estate's own longtime housekeeper, did not move. She stood with her hands folded before her apron, her eyes flicking with a particular careful discretion decades of service had cultivated toward Isadora rather than toward the striking dark-haired woman clinging possessively to the Duke's arm. Arabella Vance offered a small, triumphant smile toward the assembled servants, her gaze sweeping across the grand marble entrance hall, with a calculating appraisal of a woman already imagining herself its rightful mistress. "How charming," Arabella said, her voice carrying a faint and deliberate condescension. "I confess I had expected the current Duchess to be rather more distressed by this arrangement. Alaric tells me she is a remarkably practical woman." Isadora regarded her husband and his mistress with an expression that carried none of the devastation either of them had clearly anticipated finding there. She set the leather ledger down upon the hall's own marble side table with a deliberate, unhurried care, and reached into the small pocket of her gray traveling dress, withdrawing a single folded sheet of paper. "Alaric," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the stunned and increasingly uncomfortable silence of the entrance hall, "I believe you will find this considerably more useful than any further conversation between us this morning." She held the paper out towards him. Alaric, his confident expression flickering with genuine confusion for the first time since he had entered the hall, took it from her hand and unfolded it with the particular, careless haste of a man who did not yet understand the ground had already shifted beneath his feet. "What is this?" he said, scanning the document's brief and formal language. "My resignation," Alaric, Isadora said. "From the position of Duchess of Fenwick, and from every practical duty attached to it, I find I have no further wish to manage an estate whose master has just publicly declared before the whole of its household staff that he requires my services no longer. Before we continue, subscribe now and tell me in the comments. If your own husband paraded his mistress before your household staff, expecting your silent and dutiful compliance, would you weep before your own servants? Or would you simply hand him a piece of paper and let him discover, in the weeks that followed, precisely how much of his own fortune had always depended on you?" Alaric's confusion deepened into genuine alarm as he read the document's precise language a second time. "This is absurd, Isadora," he said. "You cannot simply resign from a marriage. You are my wife. Whatever arrangement I make regarding my own household is entirely within my own authority to determine. I do not resign from our marriage." "Alaric," Isadora said, "the law, as you well understand, does not permit me quite that particular freedom. I resign rather from the considerable labor I have performed on behalf of this estate for the past 9 years. labor you have never once troubled yourself to notice, still less to value, and which I find myself entirely unwilling to continue performing for a household that has just installed my own replacement in its east wing. What labor? All Alaric said, his voice carrying the particular dismissive confidence of a man genuinely unable to imagine his wife's daily occupations amounted to anything of genuine consequence. You manage the linens, Isidora. You approve the menus. I hardly think I own the mills, Alaric, Isidora said. The entrance hall fell into a silence considerably heavier than any that had preceded it. To understand the particular and devastating calm with which Isidora Fenwick received her husband's public cruelty that October morning, one must return to the autumn of 1863, 9 years earlier, when Isidora Hartwell was the 22-year-old only daughter of Josiah Hartwell, a textile magnate whose considerable fortune built through decades of careful and often ruthless industrial expansion across the mills of Lancashire had made him one of the wealthiest men in the north of England, whose name did not in itself carry any hereditary title whatsoever. Josiah Hartwell had built his fortune from considerably humbler beginnings than the grand mills and considerable holdings he eventually came to command. Beginning as the son of a weaver who had watched the industry that fed his own family transform entirely across a single generation, the great steamward mills rising along the rivers of Lancashire, the hand looms falling silent one by one, the old certainties of a trade passed from father to son, giving way to something faster, larger, and considerably less forgiving of those who could not adapt to it. Josiah had understood from his own earliest years in the trade that the man who understood which cloth would sell, and to whom, and at what price, held rather more power over his own future than the man who merely produced it, and had built through decades of careful attention to precisely this understanding. An industrial empire that eventually encompassed some 11 separate mills across 3 counties. He had watched his only daughter grow into a young woman of formidable and often underestimated intelligence, and had made certain from her own girlhood that whatever marriage she eventually made would not leave her defenseless against the particular vulnerabilities his own considerable experience had taught him, titled families so often visited upon wealthy brides of trade origin. A title looks very well on a wedding announcement. Is Adidora, he had told her, in the weeks before her marriage to all Alaric Fenwick, sitting in the same modest but comfortable study from which he had built the whole of his considerable empire. But it does not spin a single yard of cloth, nor does it, in my experience, reliably purchase good character. I do not forbid this marriage, since I can see plainly the affection you presently carry for the young Duke, but I will insist upon a particular structure to your own inheritance. One that ensures whatever fortune you eventually control remains entirely and permanently your own, whatever affection your husband does or does not continue to demonstrate across the years of your marriage. All Alaric Fenwick had been in the earliest days of their courtship a man of genuine and considerable charm. Golden-haired, quick-witted, possessed of the particular effortless grace that came from centuries of aristocratic breeding, whatever the emptiness of his own actual coffers. His Adora, then only 22, and genuinely hopeful for the partnership her own father's happy marriage to her late mother had modeled for her, had fallen in love with a man she believed capable of genuine warmth, and had entered the marriage with a sincerity that made the whole of what followed considerably more painful than a marriage of mere convenience might have proven. Josiah had engaged his own solicitor, a careful and meticulous man named Mr. Cornelius Blackwood, to structure the marriage settlement with a particular and deliberate thoroughness. The whole of the Hartwell textile empire, including its 11 mills, and the considerable industrial machinery each contained, placed into a trust administered solely by Isidora herself, entirely separate from any joint marital property or general household assets that might otherwise have fallen under all Alaric's control through the ordinary operation of English law. The mills belong to you, Isidora, recorded as such at the county registry, and in the trust's own formal documents. Blackwood had explained to her, laying the deed before her at the time of her father's death, some 3 years into her marriage. Your husband may enjoy whatever income the mill's continued operation provides the estate through the ordinary arrangements you yourself choose to establish, but he holds no ownership interest in the mills themselves, and cannot sell them, mortgage them, or otherwise dispose of any part of them without your own explicit and witnessed consent. Isadora had understood at the time the general shape of this protection, though she had not fully appreciated in the optimistic early years of her marriage quite how significant it would eventually prove. The marriage's early years had proceeded with a warmth that Isadora, in her own genuine hope, had believed entirely sincere. It was in the 4th year of their marriage that Alaric's own attention had begun gradually, and then with increasing speed, to drift toward London's more fashionable and considerably less respectable social circles. His own ambitions within Parliament and society, drawing him steadily away from the quiet, methodical satisfaction his Adora took in managing both the estate, and with growing personal involvement following her father's death, the whole of the Hartwell textile empire she had inherited. All Alaric had grown, across the years that followed, increasingly resentful of his wife's evident competence in matters he considered beneath a duchess's proper concern, treating her own considerable business acumen as a private embarrassment rather than a source of genuine pride, and had begun by the 7th year of their marriage a series of increasingly public indiscretions that Isadora had endured with the same quiet, watchful patience she brought to every genuine difficulty her marriage produced. It was in the 8th year of their marriage that Alaric had made the acquaintance of Arabella Vance, a young woman of considerable beauty and considerably ambitious social standing, whose own family's modest fortune had left her hungry for precisely the kind of aristocratic elevation a duke's devoted attention seemed to promise. Isadora had learned of the growing relationship, not through any dramatic confrontation, but through the particular quiet vigilance her father's own business training had instilled in her. A chance remark from a visiting cousin, a conversation overheard through a partially open study door, the gradual and undeniable pattern of her husband's continued and increasingly desperate visits to fashionable London that no genuine parliamentary obligation could reasonably account for. She had said nothing to Alaric directly, understanding with the particular, clear-eyed patience her father had instilled in her, that a husband cornered too early in his deception would simply construct a more careful concealment rather than confess the truth of his own increasingly desperate circumstances. It was Mrs. Pewit, the estate's own long-time housekeeper, whose quiet loyalty to Isadora had remained steady throughout the whole of the marriage's slow deterioration, who had first alerted her some weeks before the confrontation in the entrance hall to the particular arrangements all Alaric had begun making. His Graces instructed the East Wing to be prepared for a guest. Your Grace, Mrs. Pewit had confided some days before the confrontation in the particular careful lowered tones of a servant torn between loyalty and fear. I do not know the full particulars, but I have observed enough of the correspondence passing through this house to understand that His Grace's attentions have settled rather firmly upon a young woman he intends to introduce here directly, rather than maintaining the discretion society generally expects of such arrangements. Isadora had received this information with the same careful, methodical composure she had learned across 9 years of increasingly difficult marriage, to bring to every fresh cruelty her marriage produced. She had understood with the particular clear-eyed patience her father's own teaching had instilled in her precisely what her own response required, and had spent the following days quietly preparing precisely the resignation letter she would eventually present to Alaric before the whole of his own household staff. I do not intend to weep before this household, Mrs. Pewit, she told her own housekeeper, in the quiet privacy of her own study. Nor do I intend to depart in disgrace, as I suspect all Alaric fully anticipates. I intend, rather, to remind my husband precisely whose labor has sustained this estate for the better part of a decade, and precisely What happens to a household whose own income depends entirely upon a wife he has just publicly discarded? Now standing in the grand entrance hall as her husband stared in dawning horror at the resignation she had just handed him, Isadora understood, with a calm that came from years of careful and deliberate preparation, precisely how swiftly the whole of Fenwick Park's carefully maintained grandeur would collapse without her own continued and largely unacknowledged management. Before we continue, subscribe now and tell me in the comments if you discovered at the very moment of your husband's cruelest public declaration that the very fortune sustaining his entire household had always and only belonged to you. Would you savor the reversal slowly, or simply walk away, and let his own arrogance finish the work you had already begun? I own the mills, Alaric, Isadora repeated into the stunned silence that had fallen across the entrance hall. Every acre of the Fenwick estate's remaining agricultural land generates a fraction of the income this household actually requires to sustain itself. The whole of the remainder, the servants' wages, the tradesmen's accounts, the very coal that heats this hall, flows from the profits of 11 textile mills my own father built, and which I alone have managed since his death through a trust that has never at any point in our marriage permitted your own direct access to its principal. That is not possible, Alaric said, his earlier confident authority draining rapidly from his voice. The mills were part of your dowry. They passed to the estate upon our marriage. They did not, all Alaric, Isadora said. My father structured the trust with precisely this eventuality in mind, understanding better than either of us perhaps fully appreciated at the time, exactly what kind of husband a titled but impoverished family so often produced. You have received across 9 years of marriage a generous quarterly income drawn from the mill's considerable profits. You have never received nor were you ever entitled to receive any ownership interest in the mills themselves. Arabella Vance, whose earlier triumphant composure had begun over the course of this exchange to falter into something considerably closer to genuine alarm, turned toward Alaric with an urgency that carried none of her earlier practiced elegance. Alaric, she said. What is she saying? You told me the estate's income was entirely secure, that this arrangement would provide us both considerable comfort. I believed it was secure, Alaric said, his voice breaking into something considerably closer to genuine panic. I did not know the particulars of my own wife's trust required such thorough examination. You never once troubled yourself to ask, Alaric, Isadora said. You accepted the quarterly income my management provided without ever inquiring into its true source, precisely as you accepted the whole of my labor across this marriage without ever troubling yourself to value it. I find this morning that I have grown considerably tired of that particular arrangement. Isadora retrieved her leather ledger from the marble side table with the same unhurried calm she had maintained throughout the whole of the confrontation, and turned toward the door. Mrs. Pewitett, she said, addressing her own housekeeper directly, I shall be departing for London within the hour. I would ask that you continue your own excellent management of this household in my absence, though I confess I cannot promise the estate's income will continue arriving with quite the regularity it has thus far enjoyed. Isadora, Alaric said, stepping forward with a desperation that carried none of his earlier imperious confidence. You cannot simply leave. This is madness. Whatever grievance you carry, we might discuss it privately rather than we might have discussed it privately, Alaric, at any point across these past 9 years. Isadora said, had you shown the slightest genuine interest in discussing anything beyond your own comfort and your own considerable vanity, you did not choose discussion this morning. You chose to present your mistress to my own household staff, expecting my silent and dutiful compliance. I find I have very little patience remaining for that particular expectation. She departed Fenwick Park within the hour, precisely as she had informed Mrs. Pewit, traveling by her own private carriage to the modest, but genuinely comfortable London townhouse her father had purchased decades earlier, structured under the same careful trust arrangement that protected the whole of her considerable inheritance from any claim Alaric might otherwise assert against it. The weeks that followed brought a reckoning considerably more thorough and considerably more devastating than Alaric had initially anticipated. Isadora, drawing upon Mr. Blackwood's own continued and thorough legal counsel, formally instructed the mill's own management to redirect the whole of their considerable profits away from Fenwick Park's general accounts and into her own independent holdings. A redirection the original trust's own careful terms, made entirely and legally straightforward to execute. Within a fortnight, the estate's tradesmen, accustomed for years to prompt and reliable payment through arrangements Isadora had quietly managed, began receiving notices that their accounts would require considerably more patience than the Duke's own household had previously demonstrated. The coal merchants, the wine importers, the very butcher who had supplied Fenwick Park's considerable kitchens for a generation, found themselves informed with increasing and uncomfortable regularity that payment would arrive somewhat delayed, pending the estate's own reorganization of its financial affairs. All Alaric, facing the sudden and genuinely alarming collapse of an income he had never once troubled himself to understand the true source of, traveled to London within the month, seeking an audience with his own wife, in the same townhouse offices, where Mr. Blackwood now conducted the whole of Isadora's considerable business affairs. Isadora, Alaric said, arriving in a state of visible and increasingly desperate disarray. The estate cannot sustain itself without the income you have withdrawn. The servants have not been paid in a fortnight. Mrs. Pewit informs me 2 of the under-housemates have already given their notice. I am aware, all Alaric, Isadora said, receiving him in Blackwood's own office with the same composed calm she had maintained throughout the whole of the confrontation at Fenwick Park. I confess I find myself unsurprised. The estate has, in truth, depended entirely upon my own management and my own mill's considerable profits for the better part of a decade. I merely withdrew the labor I have provided so consistently and so invisibly across the whole of our marriage. What do you want? All Alaric said, his voice carrying a genuine and chastened desperation that bore no resemblance whatsoever to his earlier confident cruelty. I will send Arabella away. I will do whatever you require to restore the estate's income. I do not require you to send Arabella away, Alaric, Isadora said. I require rather a formal legal separation on terms my own solicitor has already prepared, which will confirm my complete and uncontested ownership of the mills and their considerable income, entirely separate from any further claim you might otherwise attempt to assert against them. I am prepared to provide the estate a modest and clearly defined quarterly allowance sufficient to maintain its basic operations, though considerably less generous than the arrangement you have, until this month, enjoyed without ever troubling yourself to understand its true origin. Herrick, stripped of both his mistress's continued confidence in his own financial security, and the whole of the income he had spent 9 years taking entirely for granted, signed the separation agreement within the fortnight, understanding with a bitterness he did not entirely trouble himself to conceal that his own careless cruelty had cost him considerably more than his pride. Arabella Vance, informed of the estate's genuine and rapidly worsening financial difficulties, departed Fenwick Park within her own ambitions toward a comfortable and prosperous future as Duchess entirely and permanently abandoned, once the true and modest scope of Alaric's remaining resources became apparent. Isadora Hartwell, for she resumed her own father's name entirely following the separation's finalization, expanded the mill's considerable operations in the years that followed into one of the most formidable textile empires in the whole of the north of England, investing in modern machinery and considerable improvements to her own workers' welfare, with the same careful attention her father had always brought to his own business affairs. I have thought often in the years since of how differently that morning might have concluded. Isadora told a young protégé once many years later standing in the same London offices, where Mr. Blackwood had once explained the full scope of her father's careful protection. Had my father never insisted upon the particular structure that kept the mill so thoroughly and permanently my own, Had I confronted all Alaric prematurely before I had gathered the composure required to hand him my own resignation rather than my own tears? Had I simply wept that morning before his own household staff, rather than allowing the truth of 9 years' invisible labor to speak for itself? You give a great deal of credit to careful preparation, Your Grace, the young woman observed. Entire and deliberately so, Isidora said. I have come to believe across the whole of my life since that morning that the difference between a woman destroyed by a husband's public cruelty and a woman who transforms that cruelty into her own complete liberation rarely comes down to some dramatic stroke of fortune. It comes down instead to whether she has spent the quiet years beforehand, building something genuinely her own, and the patience to let her husband discover entirely on his own careless terms precisely how much of his own comfort had always depended upon labor he never once thought to value. Isidora never remarried, finding in her own independent management of a textile empire that had grown under her direct and considerable attention into one of England's most respected industrial concerns. A satisfaction she was for the whole of her subsequent life, entirely unwilling to surrender to another arrangement, however advantageous society might have judged it. She hosted in the years that followed occasional gatherings for young women newly inheriting their own family fortunes, sharing with them in the same careful and deliberate manner her own father had once shared his wisdom with her, the particular lesson that had defined the whole of her own remarkable transformation. A husband may declare before the whole of his own household staff that he requires your services no longer, she would tell them, standing in the very mill offices her father had once built from nothing. He cannot, however, declare himself independent of the very labor and the very fortune that sustains his own comfort, however loudly or however confidently he might wish to believe otherwise. I would advise you all, whatever fortune you eventually inherit or build through your own labor, to know precisely where your own power resides, long before any husband ever thinks to test its limits.